my first exposure to that work of what New Zealand was doing in relation to training and qualifications started back in 2014. So at that time, I was working in the Australian government in a regulatory executive role and was halfway through my PhD research. Succinctly, my research was a global study on how regulatory agencies built and maintained regulatory capability and capacity. So this led to a conversation with Wendy Cale and Peter Mumford from New Zealand and others then from Skills in New Zealand. This was all a part of me incorporating the New Zealand work as a potential case study. This then led to my involvement in 2014-15 as the independent and non-New Zealand member of the Justice and Law Regulatory Compliance Qualification Development Program. That rolls off the tongue. And that then flowed into 4 years involvement between 2016 and 19, again as the independent member of the G-Reg 3D network. Now, what's important for those of you who don't know, that the 3 Ds relate to the design, development and delivery of the G-Reg qualifications that Tony will be presenting on shortly. So from a research perspective, and combined with my lived experience as a regulatory manager, regulatory executive and academic, I can confidently say that the New Zealand qualifications and associated framework are globally unique. So for example, while there's been dedicated and focused training and qualifications for auditors and inspectors and investigators, prosecutors, and a range of other regulatory and enforcement functions and roles, there was no perhaps holistic and integrated training and qualification that articulated the foundations of regulation and also the component parts of regulatory delivery in a way that the New Zealand approach has. Simply put, G-Reg has unified regulators and professionalised regulation in New Zealand and made the sector more aware of itself. And perhaps from my perspective, most significantly, it has recognised the critically important role of those public sector staff who don't immediately recognise themselves or even identify as being a regulator, but who play a crucial role in supporting effective regulatory delivery. As I mentioned, we're going to undertake some Slido polls. We're going to ask you 3 short questions across the presentation today. And the reason for this is twofold. Firstly, it assists Tony by providing him with a sense of where you are as an audience so that he can expand upon or amplify certain points during his presentation. And also secondly, it might assist you as participants to start shaping your specific questions that you'd like to ask Tony during the Q&A phase. Now, these questions will be quick. We need to keep moving, so you probably only have 30 to 45 seconds to respond. So if we could have the first Slido question, please. And the first Slido question asks, how happy are you with your current regulatory training or continuing professional development? And it ranges from very unhappy, unhappy, neutral, happy, and very happy. It's like watching an auction. I can see 76 bidders, 68. So as I said, it's not going to be open for long. So if you could just post your vote. And you'll notice in the question there, we've also included in brackets, or continuing professional development. So what we're trying to capture here is both that initial mandatory training your regulatory staff may need to undertake, but also continuing professional development that they're exposed to throughout their career. We'll give about 15 more seconds. So I think once this goes past 100, we might stop that, 94. Okay, we'll stop it there, Chin. Thank you for that. So we'll come back to that that one shortly, but in a similar vein, Slido question 2 is, how frequently are you receiving regulatory training or continuing professional development? So here we just want to get an understanding of the increments. How often are you getting this training? Is it 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, or a greater than 24-month period? Well, thank you, everyone. Those 2 poll questions. We will come back to them at the end of Tony's question, but already there's some trends and issues there about your satisfaction or lack of, and how infrequently you seem to be getting exposed to regulatory training. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce you to Tony McKenna from Skills New Zealand, our presenter for today. Tony has been involved in education for most of his career, specifically in workplace-based education for the past 20 years, and has a passion for seeing people recognised for their workplace skills and knowledge with formal qualifications. Tony has overseen the successful implementation of the regulatory compliance qualifications within the regulatory sector. And in this presentation, Tony will detail how G-Reg has been a flagship for the delivery of qualifications using online delivery, and also has been an exemplar for how this can make qualifications accessible and achievable for regulators. Now, Tony prides himself on being able to translate the language of standards and qualifications into real-world application in the workplace. And I can personally attest to this translation skill that Tony has, because irrespective of the nature of our discussions or the decisions we were making as an advisory board over the years, Tony would continually put it to us, and he would ask us, so what will this look like for the learner? How could the learner apply this knowledge in the workplace? And what demonstrable difference would the learner's peers and supervisors see once they have this learning? So on that note, over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Grant. Now, if we can get the slides up, please. I should say that Grant missed one of my intrepid journeys this morning. I also went down to the letterbox and back. So I've had some time out of the house, thank goodness. And it's actually raining here, so not very pleasant. So look, it's great to be able to talk to you about the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative. And Chin, if you wouldn't mind bringing up the first slide. I'll give you a bit of context for how G-Reg came to be. I'll just wait for the slide to come through. But basically, we had a Productivity Commission report in 2014 that pointed out that there were a few things that we could have been doing better in the regulatory space. And as you can see there, there were some failures that we had in New Zealand that you may or may not be aware of. And it highlighted essentially that there was no common approach, that lots of organizations were doing a lot of reinvention of the wheel, and that it was difficult to see or have any way of measuring how capability was able to be measured. So the initiative was, as a result of that, came out of that report. So essentially we ended up with a partnership between central and local government agencies, and the whole idea of the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative is that its main aim is to work on leadership, culture, regulatory practice, workforce capability, and even gets down in some areas into the systems side of things. What's important here is that it's voluntary. There's no requirement for this to have been done. It wasn't, the Productivity Commission report didn't say that G-Reg had to be put in place. The sector itself took the findings from the report and decided that this was something that needed to be done. Next slide, please. So there's been a massive work program over the last 6 years. The qualifications have been probably the main thing, but that's, I guess in some respects, the reason the qualifications stand out is because they were easily measurable. We can tell exactly how many people have done the qualifications and how many have completed them successfully. So they're an easy metric, if you like, of one of the pieces of work. But there's been massive amounts of other work. We have annual conferences now. The first one started in 2016 with about 120 participants only in Wellington. And last year's conference, we had over 600 in Wellington, Auckland, and Christchurch. And some of the topics and themes that we've covered in the work programs over that period have been the use of information, risk and the communication of risk, the exercise of discretion, and regulatory stewardship. The other thing that is interesting is that the qualifications themselves are now 5 years old, nearly 6 years old. And every 5 years in the New Zealand qualification system, we have to review these qualifications. So we would have pre-COVID-19 begun a process of pulling together an advisory group and reviewing the G-Reg qualifications. We still hope to be able to do that, but obviously in these new circumstances, we'll be figuring out how we can still do this as effectively as possible. The key philosophy, I suppose, is if they're not broken, let's not go trying to make them fix them. And at the moment, the qualifications seem to be suiting the sector perfectly. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of the structure, my office in Wellington is based in Featherston Street, and Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment that hosts G-Reg is in Stout Street. And I'm pretty sure there's a groove in the footpath between the skills office and MB, because I pretty much went down there every Monday at 4 o'clock for a meeting over the last 5 years. So you can imagine that it's been a highly scrutinized and highly engaged project, if you like, with G-Reg. There are the funding, and the main overarching structure is that there was a CE group, a CE forum, 13 government agencies that funded G-Reg. And then under that, there are some deputies that form the steering group that met on a monthly basis, the secretariat that met every week, the 3D networkers grant is mentioned, and we had a learning and development subgroup as well around learning and assessment design for building the qualifications model. So considerable oversight at each level. G-Reg signed off on the work we did with them in our partnership with the initiative. Next slide, please. So skills itself, in New Zealand, we have a formal New Zealand Qualifications Authority which manages and administers the qualifications. Skills is a standard setting body. So we are charged with looking after developing qualifications and implementing them on the framework with the NZQA, the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. So the qualifications are official and formal. They can be achieved through other sources of provider, polytechnics, universities, and private training establishments. But in the case of G-Reg, predominantly, it's the industry that have developed these qualifications. It's the industry that's designed them and helped us build them, and it's the industry that's implementing those qualifications, which is fairly unique for this area. Next slide, please. So we have 5 qualifications ranked at level 3 through to level 6 on the New Zealand Qualifications Framework. We call them core knowledge, operational knowledge and practice, specialized operations, and specialist investigations. We try not to talk about them in terms of their levels, because people do get a bit hung up about, you know, I've got a degree, why do I do a level 3 qualification sort of arguments? And we've always talked about it as being that the level 3 qualification is core knowledge. We want every regulator to know this stuff. It's general, it's generic, and it's across both central and local government. And then as you specialize and move up through your regulatory job, if you like, you move through into more practical, more on-job specific type qualifications. All of the material that we've used to develop the 2 online packages of learning and assessment were provided by subject matter experts in what we call in-kind contributions. So while the actual funding for G-Reg has been pretty much what you'd call a shoestring, most of the contribution has come from people giving up their time and being part of and participating in many of the working groups that we put together for this. Across the board, we think there's around about 14,000 people working in regulation in New Zealand. And more significantly, and what was quite important about this whole project right from the beginning, was that we wanted to make sure that there was a local and central government flavor to everything we did, because previously with qualifications for regulation or the regulatory area, they were predominantly seen as for central government, and councils didn't engage. So it was quite important that we wanted our local councils to see themselves in this, and that the learning between central and local government was transferable. Next slide, please. So you can see here the structure a little bit. The core knowledge is generic. It's an online package. Operational knowledge is the same. We're just in a review cycle with that qualification at the moment. And then you've got practice and specialized operational practice, which are both based on essentially people doing their job. And at level 5, it's in the specialist areas. So there's 4 disciplines, if you like: the audit, investigation, inspection, and operations. And then our pinnacle qualification, which is the diploma, at the moment only in specialist investigations. Potentially the review of the level 6 qualification may look to add some additional strands to that one as well for the other disciplines that people do where they're not just necessarily an investigator. Those top 3 qualifications are based around a more traditional workplace-based assessment model, whereas, as I say, the core knowledge and operational knowledge, we deliberately designed that to be delivered across an online platform. Next slide, please. So just focusing on core knowledge as I guess, it's the entry-level qualification, but it's also the one that's had the most uptake. Basically, we built 6 self-paced modules. The topics are there: the New Zealand regulatory system, regulatory concepts and models, knowledge of the law, activities, managing information, and professional conduct. And they were structured around the qualification, of course, but also around what we considered a new person coming into regulation would need to know, and also someone who may have been in regulation for a long time, but may have actually become an expert in their own specific field, but not necessarily remember how and when they learned to be a regulator, if that makes sense. So the critical thing there was that we couldn't write a textbook for every single regulatory organization. So what we did was basically make the material generic and pull from as many sources as we possibly can. So many different agencies provided us with their internal documentation, their own training, material, models that they use in their agencies, and so on, and basically helped us both make sure that the material was broad and therefore applicable to a wide audience, but also made it so that it would still hang together under those sort of 6 topic areas. What we also stressed really strongly with the delivery of the qualifications was that, and I always use this analogy, and sometimes I got a bit shouted down by it, but it was basically that we found that early on, many of the earlier adopters of the qualification basically just dumped the textbook on the student's desk. And that's sort of the terminology I'm using, but essentially they gave people access to the online package with little or no support. And what basically happened was it failed miserably because people didn't engage, they didn't understand why they had to do this, they didn't get, why are they learning about Auckland Council and they work at Immigration New Zealand. And there was a lot of feedback that this wasn't working very well. So one of the things we stressed to organizations was that they had to take the content and they had to contextualize it for their own in-house delivery. So the organizations that did that very effectively found that the uptake for the qualifications rose considerably, but also the results, people actually engaged, they understood it. And it was also a great in-house development opportunity for staff, because they would take staff who'd completed a module and ask them to run workshops on that module with new staff coming in, so they could actually, encourage more staff and become champions for the actual the delivery of the qualifications. And that basically created a massive uptake in the qualification itself, and in the feedback we received on its effectiveness. The other thing that we did was we built it around automated assessment. Now, this was very new from a New Zealand perspective, using online assessment where the computer was doing the marking. Again, I've tended to talk of this in terms of doing the driver's license. You can learn to drive, and in this case, we provide you with the driver's manual to a certain extent. You can learn to drive by being taught by your parents or by going to a driving school, but you have to sit the one test. And if you pass that test, you get your driver's license. Well, in this case, we didn't want to be quite that hard and fast with core knowledge, but what we basically did was built a 3 strikes assessment model. The learner gets 2 goes at the question, and at each time they get to review their answers and look and see what they get wrong or got right. And then if they have not been successful after 2 attempts, there's an intervention by their workplace. So their learner support person, there will be a designated person in their organization, gets a message that says, Tony hasn't been successful after 2 attempts. Here's the questions he's getting wrong. Perhaps you should have a conversation and a discussion with him. And so then they can release the 3rd and final attempt for, hopefully, success. Next slide, please. So we built a learning management platform for G-Reg. So G-Reg owns a learning management system, and we implemented the qualifications on that system. One of the main reasons why we went with online was we knew we were going to have a fairly high uptake of the qualifications. So we wanted to be able to scale very quickly. And in fact, I'd argue we almost didn't anticipate just how quickly we would grow. And I think in our first year, we had about 550 learners. Last year, we had over 2,500 enrolled learners on the platform. So you can only really do that in that sort of scale with an online delivery mechanism. The key there also, as we talked about, that we wanted organizations to provide their own context, and also that they were responsible for their learners. We didn't want them to just consider, oh, well, it's all online, you take care of it all. It was that you have to engage with the system, you have to be involved, and you have to support your own people. Skills can't do that, an administrator can't do that, and we aren't the experts in the regulatory area anyway, so it wasn't going to be possible. The automated assessment was critical. It does create some frustrations for some learners, and it certainly does create some interesting dilemmas when it comes to designing good questions. And we certainly have, I think we've had 3 reviews of the assessment question sets to this point, and each time we've refined the questions to make them a little bit more user-friendly, if you like. We had last year, every 5 years, we also have to do what's called a consistency review with NZQA, and we were very fortunate to get a glowing review from them on the model that we've used for core knowledge. The other thing that was interesting was that early on, the sector was saying, well, hang on a second here. I've been doing regulation for 30 years. I've been working and involved in regulation for 30 years. Why do I need to do this qualification? And it was a kind of good argument, but the reality was that we did have people who had that kind of experience who completed the qualification, in part to take a leadership role, but also out of interest for themselves. And almost to a person, they indicated that they got something out of it, or it refreshed something that they'd forgotten, and that it reminded them of that, and brought them back down to the basics of what it means to be a regulator. So we found that that's been well received for that purpose. And also, we also got a lot of feedback from new people into regulation. It was fine that they may have done a degree, or they may have done study in policy or in politics or whatever at university, but when it came to actually working in a regulatory house, a regulatory shop, they really didn't know that much about it. Again, once very facetiously, and I did get growled at for this, I indicated that it was core knowledge was a little bit like doing a civics class, or I think in America they call it civics, where you learn a little bit about how your country actually works, how it ticks, how laws get made, how our judiciary works, and so on. And there's all of that is in the content for the level 3. And a lot of people just didn't really know that as well as you might have thought they should have from coming out of a school education. So the scale there, as you can see, we started with 550 in the first year. We had 2012 last year. And in fact, I just got the new numbers today to May, and that's including this lockdown period. We have over 1,000 learners already. So potentially we're going to even have more numbers than we had for last year, which was a record for just the core knowledge alone. And in fact, the operational knowledge, the level 4 package, has more numbers now than it had for the whole of last year as well. So the growth has been extraordinary, and it's been predominantly, I think, again, because of this motivated sector, the sector that wants to see this kind of consistency of training and consistency of learning for regulators, albeit at a basic level. The other important thing around all of this is that the work we've done can be reproduced. I've spoken to regulators from Vietnam and from Canada who've both indicated that they're interested in this kind of a model for delivering to large numbers of people across the country. And I guess the main interest is the consistency that this provides. It gives us an absolute, consistent result, if you like, from the qualification. If we know that every single one of these numbers of people have at least learnt the core knowledge, we know that if they transfer between organizations, they actually have a common understanding. So it's an advantage to workplaces, it's an advantage to the individual that they can achieve these qualifications. And of course, there is a cost, as there is with all of these things. And in New Zealand, it's $350 plus GST to complete the core knowledge national certificate. Next slide, please. So this gives you just a bit of a sense of the organizations involved. This is a little bit out of date. I think this is at the end of last year, but we had 39 local government organizations out of our 70 odd councils in New Zealand, and 34 central government. And we think there's about 60-ish, depending on how you define central government organizations. So a huge range of organizations from, as you can see there, from the Accident Compensation Corporation through to Whanganui District Council. So that's just to give you a sense of the scale of organizations, and all sorts of interesting regulators are inside that list. We've also had interest from private regulators or regulators who subcontract to government agencies. So one of our interesting ones that we're looking at the moment is Vehicle Testing New Zealand, who do a lot of the licensing of cars and vehicles, and they are working on behalf of the New Zealand Transport Agency. So they're interested in putting some of their people through this so they understand why they're actually doing what they do every day. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, and at the end here, the key is that the qualifications themselves have been a pathway for people new to regulation, as well as validation for experienced regulators. As we've moved up through to the higher level qualifications, that's been very much the case. We are wanting to recognize if you like, the currency of those people working in those roles at the higher level in their organization. So one of the challenges we've had with that is because we've moved, as soon as we moved away from an online assessment methodology, we need what we call workplace assessors in New Zealand. So that's other regulators who either already have the qualification or have equivalent skills and knowledge, training to become assessors so they can assess their peers. And the big challenge with that is just getting those people to commit to the time that's required. And there is a bit of time involved. And I suppose the buddying and mentoring that might go with that across agencies. So it's been our biggest challenge. We probably have the greatest demand at the level 5 and level 6, and we have the least ability to actually respond to that demand because of our pool of assessors. We have about 40 odd or 50 odd at the moment. And when I first put this model together, we were looking at roughly one assessor assessing 10 people a year. So that would be about 500 learners if we had 50 assessors. But what we found is that the assessors are doing this mostly out of love, and therefore only in their own time, or in time if their workplace allows it. And so they've been really only able to handle about 3 to 5 learners per year. So that's actually reduced our numbers quite considerably. So those New Zealand regulators that are hopefully listening in today, they'll know that I'm a broken record on this, but we are looking for more assessors so that we can widen the offering of the higher level qualifications across the sector. The other thing that's been huge this year and started this year, but unfortunately with COVID-19 has had to be put on hold, was the development of a continuing education program. If Monica talks about New Zealand envy, I'd say we've got a bit of Aussie envy around what ANZSOG offers in terms of continuing education for regulators, and certainly a model we look to for some of the work we've been doing with G-Reg. We've got a program. We have actually quite a comprehensive program, and if you're interested, have a look at the G-Reg website. But unfortunately, of course, it's all on hold at the moment. But what we wanted there was we wanted to design continuing education so we could say to people, okay, well, you may or may not be interested in the qualifications, but how are you staying current? How are you keeping up to date with new trends and regulation? And one of the ways that we wanted to do that was to offer short, sharp workshops, mostly going to be face-to-face, but now, of course, I think we'll be having to start thinking about whether we can do it through an online delivery mechanism, but essentially offering just a variety of new topics and opportunities for learning, right from areas where we could see there was a perceived need. So for example, there's a 2-day workshop that runs on interviewing skills, but we also had our first and most successful, or obviously most successful because it was the first one, our first seminar was on policy for non-policy people. And that was oversubscribed. So we know there's a demand out there, and we know that we will be coming to look to ANZSOG for perhaps some guidance and some help around some topics from their offerings that we can also bring across to New Zealand. Lastly, and probably one of I think one of the special things we've been able to do with G-Reg is we've been in discussions with Victoria University. Sorry, can we just go back, Chin, just for one more second? Yeah, thank you. Where we've been working with them on offering credit from the G-Reg qualifications through to academic study at Victoria University. And one of the things, what they've agreed to is that we will recognise G-Reg qualifications allowing people who don't have any formal degree qualification entry to one of the approved Victoria degree programs, and they will basically get credit for their completing the degree, so they'll be able to complete it more quickly. And the other more of interest, I think, to a lot of people is that those who are already graduates with university qualifications can do join into one of the Victoria Professional Masters programs. So that's a huge thing. And interestingly, just earlier this year, I had a call from someone who is doing their master's through the chair in regulatory practice, which we have also established through G-Reg at Victoria University. So Professor Jeroen van der Hayden is the chair in regulatory practice, and he has his first master's student. So we've offered now, I think, an amazing range of qualifications from the level 3 core knowledge vocational qualification all the way through now to postgraduate study, and even on to PhDs potentially in the future. So lots of exciting things happening in the world of G-Reg. It's not going to stop, and I've been very privileged to be part of the process all the way through to this point. And at this stage, unless anything changes, we hope to continue being a partner with the initiative for many years more to come. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tony. While Tony takes a sip of water and takes a break, we'll move to our third and final Slido question. If we could have that up, please, Chin. And this question is really about: have you considered delivery of your regulatory training online, and the choices that you'll have there? Never, rarely, neutral, often, or very frequently. Of course, with COVID, which we've been talking about, we expect the figures to be a little bit skewed to the last one, but if you could just generally think pre-COVID, so it's more balanced, how often would you be putting your mind to your regulatory training in terms of it being delivered online? So we've got a clear winner there already. Mm. But again, for representation, Chin, if we can stop it as soon as it gets to 100 plus votes, that'd be good. 100 plus. Now everyone's getting voting anxiety. It's slowing down. It was going really quick before this. Okay, we just, yep, stop it anywhere now. Thanks, Chin. Well, thank you very much, Tony, for your most informative presentation. I think in the opening and welcome, Monica mentioned the Kiwi envy as being a thing. And I think on this topic, it's now very much a real thing. We'll now move to some of the quick analysis of the polls, of the Slidos. If we could have those up, please, Chin. But you probably saw quickly as you were going through, Tony, that on the first question, the level of satisfaction, and I also think I'm tracking the questions that have come through in Slido, and I'm pretty confident that you've actually started to touch upon and even answer some of them. So if we look at the level of satisfaction, How does this represent or relate to what you were finding in New Zealand when you were starting this journey? What was the level of satisfaction with people on training?
Well, it's a good question. To be fair, the initiative itself started as a result of the Productivity Commission report, but in reality, there had been a thing called the Triple CP, and I'm not even going to try and remember what that stands for, which was a group of regulators that had been concerned about the lack of consistent training and understanding of the role of the regulator that had been going for something like 10 years. And that was headed by Keith Manch, who's the CE at Maritime New Zealand. And he's been a huge advocate of the G-Reg initiative and has been a driver of it right since the beginning. So I guess I didn't come into it at that point in time, but I would clearly argue that there was concern, if not unhappiness, with the current training that was available. So it certainly reflects what this poll is showing as well.
Yeah, so in that sense, it's pretty similar. Thank you. And if we go to the next analysis, question 2, please, Chin. So this is now the frequency of training. So probably after, again, a similar comparison, what you were feeling when you were doing your initial, I suppose, prototyping and discussions with the sector, what was their exposure to frequency?
Again, not a lot. It was very ad hoc. It probably came down to induction for a lot of organizations. If they had a sound induction system, they would potentially touch on the regulatory role. It would really depend. The view of the sector was too that we didn't just want regulators, if you like, to be doing these qualifications. We wanted people who wanted to be regulators or who worked in a regulatory organization, but may not have actually understood what they may only be working in the administrative or in the marketing or in the sales area, but they may not, and so they didn't have an understanding of what it meant to be a regulator. So we wanted to give them the more generic information. So, was it something that was ongoing? No, I would say probably it was ad hoc, it was unstructured, and quite often it was only down to individual organizations. And this again seems to reflect what you've got there in the poll.
Excellent, thank you. And the final question, please, Chin. So this is now considering the move and the desire and even the need to move to online learning, Tony. We can already see, if that is even pre-COVID, there's at least 50% of people are thinking about the potential and the benefits of. So what would you say about any comments, considerations that you've noticed in the sector as you've moved to this version?
Well, I think the critical thing is, yes, online is fantastic, and there is no question that it is the future, if you like, for a lot of learning. I mean, any of you with children still at home are presumably doing a lot of their learning now online, and that is the world we've moved into. But I guess I would say there's just one proviso, and that is that it's not the be-all and end-all of everything. I mean, it's critical that you think about it in terms of particularly your own organizational needs. And that's why I stressed through my presentation and also with the sector that it's so critical that you can't just dump this thing on somebody's desk and say, there you go, get on with it. You've really got to wrap it around some support. You've got to give people, online is a new world as well. For a lot of people, they're not used to that model of seeing stuff on screens only. I know just a few days ago, talking to a colleague about, we probably spend more time looking at screens now from this working from home than we ever did in the office, because you could get up and go for a break. You could go and talk with people. You could go and sit in a meeting room, and that just took you away from the screen. So we've just got to be a little bit careful that we don't see this as the new thing and everybody has to do it. I still believe there's a very important place for still doing face-to-face learning, for organizations to take responsibility for the delivery of these qualifications, but add their own context, add their own stories and scenarios, because otherwise it doesn't have the same meaning. And then, yes, it's a pass-fail system. Yeah, it means that you passed the driver's test, but actually, would we want you on the road?
Exactly. Well, thanks for that. So, Chin, if we can go just back to the slide. So what I'm thinking here, Tony, is now that the time is getting towards 11:45, we want to probably wrap up this formal part of it. And there's lots of questions. I'm looking at the 26 questions. As I said, I think you've started to touch upon some of them. But maybe if we could just do maybe 2 of them before we transition to and let those that need to go to other commitments go. there's a nested set of questions here. One from Adam Beaumont, which talks about, has the professional regulator concept as a discipline independent of the work area? So not just being a health safe regulator, not being an environmental regulator, but the professional regulator. Yep. And that can probably be nested with a question from Anonymous about how did G-Reg and Skills NZ persuade the die-in-the-wool regulators that they needed training and regulation as an art and craft, not just in their domain. So those two questions nested, what comment would you have?
So I think the first one is, that's the desire of the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative. So that's the main, if you like, thrust of what we're trying to achieve, is that we want to see a profession of regulators like accountants, lawyers, doctors, whatever, you know, they're all the traditional ones, but there's plenty of other professions out there. And I think we're working our way slowly to that. We didn't, you know, it would be great to be able to just jump there. For example, we did think about with continuing professional education that we would actually have a points-based system and require people to have a certain number of points. But the challenge with that is it's not compulsory. You can't make it compulsory. And if you start making things compulsory, people start reacting negatively to it as well. So we're doing it slowly, and it will take some time, but it's certainly an aspiration for the initiative, and one that I think is great. As far as persuading the diet in the walls, well, I think we had some great advocates. I mean, we had you know, the top chief executives of the major government agencies praising the G-Reg initiative, funding the G-Reg initiative. So, you know, they put their money where their mouth was. And I think that we told lots of great stories. We've used LinkedIn a lot. We've used vlogs, yeah, video logs, you know, blogs, whatever you call them. And we've used a lot of real people from the sector who've said, you know, whether they did or didn't get benefit out of it. And look, we've never expected that everyone will love it. And that's certainly not been the case. But I think generally speaking, people admire what we've tried to set out to achieve here, and that we have actually got people to come on board. I think, again, you know, without singing Keith Manch's praises too much, Maritime New Zealand's an interesting example. So Keith not only put himself and all of his senior leadership team on the G-Reg Core Knowledge Qual, but every single staff member at Maritime New Zealand. And then when his board were re-elected, he got every member of his board to complete the qualification, which I thought was a phenomenal thing, because it basically, from the governance level down of that organization, they have a good understanding of what it means to be a regulator, so what they exist for. So, you know, that was a great exemplar, that you can tell that story, and that sort of brings some of those hard-nosed people across and into the world.
Thanks. Well, the one question which I'll take before we transition, Tony, there's a question here saying, Grant, any thoughts on how an equivalent to the New Zealand approach might be implemented in our wonderful federation? Well, Australia and New Zealand, both Western developed countries under the Westminster system, we already have some trans-Tasman shared regulatory regimes in place. There's no reason why it wouldn't work. One benefit you have is you only have 2 levels of government. We have one extra hurdle to coordinate, but my short answer is there is no reason why this wouldn't work. So for those people in the audience who need to sign off, you will shortly receive a brief evaluation survey. And as always, ANZSOG and NRCOP really welcome your feedback. From the NRCOP perspective, with ANZSOG, we actively work through that feedback in our debriefing sessions and our meetings. So it's a genuine offer for you to make comments and suggestions for how this might be improved. Finally, as a community of practice, these events need to be informed by your needs and interests. They need to be developed with those needs and interests in mind, and then finally delivered by those in the community who have those needs and interests at heart. So if we could have the final slide, Chin, the landing one about upcoming events. There's a bit of a taster for our upcoming webinars. That's our conclusion slide, which is 2 weeks' time, 19th of May, 11 AM AEST. What could possibly go wrong? Regulating the professions. And then a fortnight later, again, Tuesday, how can we know we're good at what we do, measuring regulatory performance? And I actually think, Tony, your presentation about core training and getting regulatory capability and capacity in our staff feeds in how we can better regulate the professions, and also how we can perhaps, you know, measure what we're doing and having increased regulatory performance. So so this is we're going to transition now. So for those staying on for the informal portion, we will continue. But those who are leaving us, on behalf of ANZSOG and NRCOP, thank you very, very much for your participation. So now, Tony, what we're going to do is we'll just go through some of these questions, and I also want to give you opportunity to make a sort of closing statement at the end when you think about the presentation and the questions you've been asked. You probably see the questions there. One of the first, or the highest ranking question, if you like, comes to people would love to know what training others were undertaking and providing so that they can learn what others are doing and what quals are available. I mean, I wonder if that's framed more as, did you do a scan of the landscape and see what was out there, and have you continued to do that, and how does G-Reg compare in that space?
Well, I think we're hoping that G-Reg will take the lead a lot more on this, and that was really through the continuing education side of things. But we also use the network, if you like, to promote and look for what other training and learning opportunities are there out there. And again, you know, we have a partnership with ANZSOG. I don't think we leverage that as well as we can or could in the future. So I think that's something else we definitely will be trying to explore. I guess the other thing, that same question gets asked in New Zealand all the time as well. And one of the interesting things we found when we were trying to build the program of continuing education was that there's a lot of agencies who do a lot of very good training in-house. And when you start asking them, well, how could you bring that across and use that so you could offer that to a whole lot of other organizations? They all, oh, no, it's really only good enough for us. It's only good for our people. And it's that sort of blushing bride thing. We really like them to say, hey, take this stuff. You could actually deliver this in these short, sharp workshops, and other organizations would get incredible value out of it. So it's almost about, let's not hide our talents, you know, away. We need to get them out and make sure they're out there. I guess the other really challenging one is that it's just very hard for organizations to post what they're doing somewhere. You know, we could do that with upcoming news, upcoming events on the website, but it's to get that there, we have to get it from people. And when you put your, you know, we'll put a request out and say, hey, who's doing something this month? Can we publish that and put it up for other people to find out about? We very rarely get a reply. And it's, I think, just because organizations are busy, they come up with the things they're doing and they know the things they need to do for themselves, but when they start looking outside, they just don't have the time. So I think that's a real challenge. You'd think in this day and age with, you know, websites and databases, it would be pretty easy, but it's not, and it never will be, I don't think.
Yeah, and one of the other more popular questions was, and you've started to touch upon this, I think, in the face-to-face workshops and seminars, is who actually teaches these regulatory qualifications? Because there's suggestions there that academics can be a bit obscure and practitioners are too busy and lack the broader context. So how have you bridged that gap to maximise delivery?
Well, we haven't, in the sense that if you take core knowledge and operational knowledge, they are blocks of learning. The learning content has come from the organizations. We've put it in, if you like, for want of a better term, there's slides. There's interactivity, there's you know, all the things that go with an online delivery mechanism. But essentially, how does that learning occur? Well, that occurs depending on the different individuals. Some will just be quite happy to work with the slides. We had quite a lot of people who want to have the facility to print every slide so they can read them on paper. We've struggled with that one because actually that's not what the online delivery is meant to be. But look, the most effective, and I guess Steve Pearce won't mind me mentioning Auckland Council. In the first year, Auckland Council put 120 learners on, and they had about 80 learners who never completed successfully. They literally just gave them the package, gave them the link to the site and said, away you go, do it in your own time. It took them longer and they didn't finish. As soon as they realized that was going to be, that had not been successful, the second year they completely changed their model and they started delivering workshops on a monthly basis, which they then got participants to get involved in. And by getting their participants to get involved, they both saw almost 100% completion, and everybody completed in time. So they actually created an internal delivery and made that the driver of the success of the qualifications. And the feedback back from the participants was much, much more positive. So it's that same, as I made the point in my presentation, this is all about workplace learning. There's not really an academic approach. The academic comes later when you get into the higher level qualifications, and that's what Jeroen is here for, the chair in regulatory practices, to take those people who, like yourself, Grant, want to get right into this regulatory world and do a PhD or a master's thesis. They can do that by literally going on and doing the study at the university. And then that language is appropriate, if you like. It's not appropriate at core knowledge level, for sure.
But there has been a question about, in these lean times, and I think you flagged something similar to running on the smell of an oily rag, but has that cost from the user's perspective ever been a real issue at the quantum that you were talking about?
No, and it's surprising, because when we very first started, at that stage, when I first started, we talked about different pricing models. And to be honest, the $350 plus GST was just a number that was plucked out of the air. There was no real rationale for it. We looked at the equivalent. If you did a level 3 certificate at a polytechnic in New Zealand, which is the equivalent of your TAFE, that usually is about a 1-year exercise, and it's about a $3,000 exercise. Yeah. So we thought a 10% figure would be about right. It's actually remarkably cheap. To complete a New Zealand certificate for that sort of money is remarkably cost effective. So no, we've never, and in fact, one of the interesting things is we've never discounted, we've never reduced it by, you know, if an agency came and said, look, we'll put 1,000 people on if you do it for $200, we've never done that. We've said to the sector, generally, that's the price. It's a sort of take it or leave it. And that's been fine. So, you know, I consider it to be very good value for what people get for it.
Yeah. And there's a question which I think you started to touch upon with the Steve Pearce Auckland City Council example. But the question is, how do you work with organisations to customise and the contextualisation?
Well, that was an interesting one. So essentially, it really comes down to, and we found with most of the organisations, it's come down to the L&D people, so the learning and development people within organisations. And then, because they're not necessarily subject matter experts, they need to work with the regulatory staff, and they provide the context. They build the learning modules. So, you know, if you take the second module is about regulatory models. So we you know, I always use the example that Inland Revenue uses a circle, MPI uses a triangle, Maritime uses a triangle. So what does Auckland Council use? And so if that's your question for, say, that topic of that module, then you get some of the people who work with the models that are used for regulatory activities at Auckland Council. You'll have a subject matter expert. Someone wrote that model or designed that model, so they are a subject matter expert, and they are probably passionate about what they've done with that model. They can then deliver to that group of people about that and talk it through and say, well, okay, why does MPI use it that way? How do we do it differently in our way? That's where there's some real valuable learning. And then it's about the stories you can tell from people's experiences. If you've got people in the room who've had to use the model, then they are immediately able to tell stories about, well, when I went to talk to so-and-so about such and such, this model was incredibly helpful because it gave me the structure to do this, this, and this. You know, and it's really quite simple stuff, really. But it's organizational. We can't provide, like, you know, if you look at the scale there, you've got 70 or 80 organizations. We can't write a core knowledge for every one of those organizations.
All right, Tony, we're getting into the last 2 minutes of the call. There's a comment here saying, is there any chance Skills New Zealand might still tour Australia once travel and assembly resume? Of course, you were planning to come here face to face. I think I'm not speaking on behalf of ANZSOG or NRCOP, but I think evidenced by the questions, there is strong interest in seeing you guys face to face over here. So we'll leave those to your bilateral discussions. Mm-hmm. Any final 20, 30-second tips and traps for people thinking about this that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, well, no, I think overall we've learned a lot as time goes on. I think the key is that you've got to be committed to this. And I guess if I said there was one thing, again, without blowing Keith's trumpet, Maritime set the bar, and it was really good because what it did was there was leadership from the senior leadership team. They bought into this. They did the qualification themselves. They got, you know, they missed missed some of the questions. You know, they got it wrong in the same way that you know, their staff got some questions wrong, and so they're able to work with their people, and their people could see them leading by example. And I think that was a huge thing. And I think the second point is that you have to look at the package, and you have to think about how you make that yours. So yes, you've got the generic material. That's what you want everyone to have, because that's the consistency. But how do you customize it? How do you make it ours as well as being the generic? And I think those are the sort of two key things we've learned out of this. It's most effective when there's leadership for the qualification and a real drive for the qualifications to be implemented. And we've seen that right across G-Reg. And then how do you paint the picture that this is valuable for us as an organization uniquely? And those would be the two main things, I think.
Well, thanks again, Tony, for being our speaker today. And also thank you to the participants. I know many from Auckland City Council and Maritime New Zealand will have to rush to the phones because they're going to be flooded with calls. I'd remind you to please fill in the short evaluation survey, and also watch out for our first Regulators policy and practice collection coming up on Tuesday the 12th. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe, and on behalf of ANZSOG and NRCOP, we look forward to your participation in future webinars. Goodbye.